Well, good afternoon. We're here for part three of our Falaise Gap tours. A bit of a delay logging on, but we're all here now. Should be no issues of connectivity this time, but there are ceremonies going on. There's reenactors going past, loads of guys in American Big Red One uniforms going past. I don't know what's going on there. But we've got the incredible Jenny Grant joining us. Hello, Jenny. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Are you looking forward to it?
I am, absolutely.
Yeah, well, so are we, because I can shut up on this one because you know way more than I do, which isn't hard because that's the thing, folks, about this show is that the Polish Armoured Division on Montormel, Hilsler 262, so much information we get has been filtered through either Canadian or British historians, and it loses something in the translation via the conduit of racism in often cases. So we're getting direct from Jenny, who's got Polish ancestry. She's studied back to the Polish archives, so we've got good history here about the first Polish Armoured Division on the Hill 262 North. And our camera feeds are both working perfectly. So they are just south of the hill. I'm on Duncan's feed right now. If you can point kind of up towards, hang on, where's Mag? Mag, you're in the field, aren't you? Hang on, where's Mag? So Mag, if you can kind of show us towards the chapel. Can you show us that way? Where is the chapel, Mag? All right. Which way are you facing? There we are. The chapel is so that it's difficult to see on the image we've got there, but I'll show on a Google image where we are, folks. And this is a Google Earth image of the area, a recent one. And there in the middle there, you can see is Hill 262 North, where the Poles get to, or some of the Poles get to on August the 19th. And then the roads coming up from San Lambert, which we covered in our earlier show with David O'Keefe, are coming up this. And where the guys are, they are on this intersection here, which is just, sort of to the side of the hill there. And the Germans in escape, or those who've got across either the ford or the bridge in San Lambert, are kind of racing up this road here. And at this intersection, they have to make a decision. Do they go left or do they go right? They've got little information at this point about what's going on. They're under observation at this point from the Poles. So that's where we're starting from, this intersection here. And then don't forget, as David O'Keefe said in the earlier show, you've got beyond Hill 262 North, over kind of beyond Kudahard, you've got elements of the 2nd SS Panzer who've already got out, who are trying to keep the gap open. And then you've got the Poles themselves on the hill. And down further in Chambord, elements of the American 90th Division. And with that little introduction done, I'm going to basically hand over to Jenny now, and we can start talking about the Poles. So the Polish Armoured Division, they're attached to Canadians, but they're kind of their own independent force in some ways, aren't they? So what has their background been briefly in the Battle of Normandy so far, before the events of middle of August?
So they begin to arrive in Arromanches at the end of July, beginning of August. They've been held back because they're slightly under strength for an armoured division. One of the big issues the Poles have is recruitment. And they're not able to sort of replenish their forces with losses. So there is an element of trying to hold them back. You've also got a backlog at Arromanches itself in terms of the actual space in being able to move these guys through. So by the beginning of July, they're in Normandy at Bayeux. They're then attached to the Canadian division, the Canadian Corps under Simmons. They've got some experience of working with the Canadians before. They've done another number of exercises, like with the 4th Canadian Armoured Division. But this is the first time that I believe that Maczek and Simmons meet. And this is where we begin to get the first of the issues with language. So Maczek speaks French, he speaks German, he speaks Russian, he speaks Ukrainian, he speaks Polish, obviously. Simmons himself is a fairly typical Brit in this regard. He's got schoolboy French, so that's how they communicate. So the expectation is then that they will be thrown into totalized, intertractable, and then into 262. Up to this point, the majority of the division obviously hasn't had combat experience, but you do have a hardcore of the division that has seen action, some of them as early as in Czechoslovakia in the beginning of 1939, and then they faced the 2nd Panzer Corps in September 39. Then they have fought as part of the Armed Cavalry Brigade in France. Some of them have fought in Norway. So there's a depth of experience and a broader perspective within this Polish division that you wouldn't necessarily see in any of the comparative sort of Allied divisions at this point.
And I think it's worth mentioning at this point that Simmons is an artilleryman. He's a former gunner, so he kind of moves with suppressing fire and creeping barrages and slowly and steady and armored personnel carriers and moving the whole force up. That's his way of working. And it's fair to say the Poles are not that at all. They're cavalry. They're cavalry in mentality. They're cavalry in history. I'm sure some of these guys are third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation cavalrymen. And so, you know, I always use the example, they are the Jeb Stuart for people. I mean, I know Dave Collins is watching, is a big Civil War buff. They are kind of the marauding, on their own cavalry, dash and elan, doing their own thing, which is both a disadvantage and advantage at the same time. It's a disadvantage in the sense that Simmons doesn't know how to use them, does he? He doesn't. The language you so correctly said is part of it, but also just unfamiliarity and probably just a bit of basic racism. They're the foreigners. We don't quite know what to do with them. And so we kind of let them do their own thing. But I think, you know, regarding them as cavalrymen is very important to understanding how they engaged. And of course, this is 2 weeks or so after the Warsaw Uprising had begun. So these guys want to start killing Germans. They want to start killing lots of Germans. And if there's SS down the road, they're going to be off down there trying to kill SS. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that within an organized situation, you've got to embrace what the Poles bring to the table and not kind of use it as a negative. That's my, you know, British take on it. Use them for what they're good at. But anyway, we're at this junction now. So tell us about, because, you know, often in the books it says the first Polish Armoured Division is on 262. It's only part of the division is there, isn't it? So explain kind of roughly how spread out the division was come sort of August 17th, 18th, 19th, because they're over a lot of distance, aren't they?
Absolutely. So the orders they receive from Monty are to secure Chambois as a priority. And Maczek is the one who brings the appreciation that actually, as you move further east and you see this Hill 262 to the north, Hill 262 to the south, and it's controlling the Chambois-Vimoutier road. So he actually makes the decision on the ground to split his forces into these two battle groups rather than to focus primarily on Chambois. So the thinking behind that is that A, if he secures the ground, he'll be able to support Chambois in more depth, but also that will prevent the escape of the German forces, which obviously is the aim of this entire stage of operations. This all goes horribly wrong to begin with. So to begin with, Kosciuszki's 2nd Armoured Regiment is sent off to Chambois, but they're sent off late at night and it's dark, and there is an issue with mispronunciation, and their French guide sends them off northeast to Champeaux rather than Chambois. So for about 12 hours, they've lost an entire armoured regiment. So in the end, they end up sending the 24th Uhlans, which is another armoured unit, and the Grenadiers, the 10th Dragoons, down to take Chambois. So what we end up with on 262 is Stefanovich's 1st Armoured Regiment takes position by midday. And then they're joined later in the day by Kosciuszki, who actually, by being further north rather than Chambois, is actually able to come and reinforce the 1st Armoured Regiment. So it's a fairly devastating mistake, but it actually turns out for the best. So what we end up with on Hill 262 is the 1st Armoured Regiment, which takes up the west and flank of this sort of prolonged ridge. And then on the east, you have Kosciuszki's 2nd Armoured Regiment. You've also got the 8th and the 9th Infantry Battalion. You've got anti-tank support. And then you've also got a battalion that's variously referred to as the Podhalion or the Highland or the Mountain Battalion, which again is the sort of infantry. This is a group that was formed in France, and they've got nothing to do with the mountains at all. They come from the whole of Poland. This is a group in 1940 where the French assume that they've got some experience with mountain warfare, and they're presented with skis to help with the invasion of Finland. But by this point, by the time of 1944, they've received, training to the same standards as the rest of the infantry. So you've got these 3 infantry battalions, you've got anti-tank support, you've got 2 armoured regiments, and you've also got this Canadian medium artillery regiment, which is providing this artillery support. Their forward observation officer, which is Captain Pierre Servini, who, because he's writing in French, gives this amazing account of the events, and we kind of get an appreciation of the Polish perspective through this French account. And although he's very sympathetic, it's one of those elements that again slightly distances us from the Polish experience, even though it's devastatingly good. He's a professional writer. He wins a literary prize for his account. And although it's extremely visceral, there is an element where we have to be slightly skeptical and treating it as an account of what happens, particularly when there are Polish accounts as well.
So I just wanted to bring in, thanks for that, was brilliant stuff, the lack of roads that go near till 262 North. And we can talk about the failure to get 262 South at some point there. But there's, on the middle of this image here, you've got the road coming up, the D16 from Chambois that goes up this way up towards Vermouth and eventually off towards Paris. Then you've got this road where the guys are there that comes up this way. But if you look, the road does a complete loop on itself here at Coudard. It goes a complete 180. Yeah. But if you look in the areas to the north, there's no roads whatsoever over here. Now, there's this one over here through Neuf-sur-Dive, which could have been a better avenue for the Germans to get out of. And that's something we could talk about a what-if scenario if we get time later on. But what happens at the intersection where Mag and Duncan are is everybody starts who's got that far. And don't forget, a lot of Germans have already been trapped at Saint-Lambert. They'll have been captured at Trun. But those that have got across the Dive River are now pushing them up this road here. And the thing is, there's no escape now. The only way, they're going to have to fight their way out now, because as you so eloquently said, there's this not immense force, but a very, very self-contained, very strong, I suppose, at least until they run out of ammunition, force around 262 North, and that road goes right past and under the hill. So if the Germans are on that road, they've got to absolutely fight their way out. And let's talk a little bit, and the guys will move on, about just the bloodletting, if you like, between the Poles and the Germans, because I really like the reference to the Eddie Florentine book. He's a French author called Stalingrad in Normandy, talking about the Falaise Gap. And he's making no suggestion that the Battle of Falaise Gap is like the Battle of Stalingrad in terms of terrain. I mean, that's a battle for a city. He's referring to the Stalingrad of Normandy for the intensity, the ferocity, the no holds bar, the desperation of this. Because let's be honest, Jenny, the Poles know if they get captured by the SS, their treatment is not going to be that of a Canadian or American POW. And the SS likewise know if they're captured by the Poles, they're not necessarily going to be treated with the same. So it's very desperate, isn't it? What's your understanding from your reading about, as we're going into this battle here, what both forces feel when they're going to be coming up against each other?
Yeah, I mean, some of that desperation you see taking the Poles out of the entire scenario. I mean, Eddie Florentine's book is brilliant in bringing just the utter brutality. And he also repopulates the landscape with civilians as well, and the huge civilian casualties. And when it comes to the Poles, obviously, Maczek refers to the Germans as been a mask that they present to the Western world. I don't want to get into this idea of the inherent evil of a nation at all. But there is a significant difference in the treatment of Eastern Europe and Western Europeans. From day one, the Luftwaffe are strafing civilians in Warsaw. They are rounding up Boy Scouts and shooting them in the street in retribution for assassinations of their officers. With the Warsaw Uprisings begun on the 1st, these chaps have got family in Warsaw who are being massacred in retribution for the Warsaw Uprising. There's also an element where I think culturally the Poles have much greater motivation to fight. Generally, either that they've been brought up and fought in the First World War and been there when Poland was born, or they've been born into this new Poland. And because it's a country that's achieved its independence after over 100 years, there is this great patriotic spirit and the sense that we are not going to lose this. So the Poles certainly have this extra motivation to fight. It's not, I don't think that they're scared. I mean, we talk about this, Savini quotes Stefanovic of, I just find it, he talks about, we are Poles, we do not surrender. But it is this unique motivation. Equally, the Germans have been told that if they do surrender, the Poles will not treat them as one would wish, shall we say.
Yeah.
Savini does, hint that some of this occurs. But yeah, with the Germans, how far it's nationality, how far it's just the utter desperation, there are those two routes out. That is the only way they're getting out. They know that Bitteritz's 2nd Panzer Corps are coming from the east. So when we're talking about the sort of 20th of August, there is that sort of desperation to meet these armoured groups to then be sort of led out. But if we're talking about the German forces, I mean, they're attacking, as you say, you've got this encircled group where they're coming from the north and also from the south, the G16. And you've got your organised groups from the east, your sort of panzer groups. You've got groups of paratroopers.
Yeah, Meindel's 3,000 paratroopers come in because they're sent to kind of be flanking and keep the gap open for the armor. So these guys are surrounded on all sides. I mean, it's a repeat in a different scale of the story in Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive early. That was at 150 Canadians. This is now we're talking of 1,500 Poles up here, and that's I'm sorry to interrupt you. That's footage of that. We're driving up there now. I will warn you, folks. There are ceremonies going on today. They hadn't published the times of these ceremonies when I advertised this show, so I kind of wondered whether there would be something or not. And because back in June there were almost no ceremonies in Normandy because of lockdown and the rules and regulations, it seems that everybody in Normandy has turned up to Montormel today, which in some ways is very good. And this is the Boisgeau they're passing now. If you can stop up for a second to talk about that, if you can just pull up somewhere that I think they are, yeah, they're stopping in the gateway there. Because this is an important building in Polish history. I'll just share a photo of it while and then I'll hand over to Jane to talk about. This is a period photo of the Boisgeau, which is a manor house sitting on this hill, and there's a Canadian ambulance in the front there. So, Jenny, I know I was interrupting your flow there, but tell us about the Boisgeau and its significance.
So the Boisgeau around this area, you can't really tell from this, but it's actually on a hillside, one of the high hills. So there's various barns that are secured by the Germans. The Boisgeau itself, the manor house, is nicknamed the Zameczka, which means the little castle. And it's where they set up the advanced dressing station. So the medical officers from the various units are treating both Poles and Germans there. On the on the second day, they're forced to move slightly further down the hill into an orchard to set up another advanced dressing station. And on the actual morning, both of these are subjected to quite a lot of artillery. And although they're displaying the Red Cross flags and the ambulances are clearly marked, they're subjected to bullets. So, for example, there's a chaplain, the 8th or 9th Battalion, I should know, Chaplain Hooper is killed, for example. One of the main sort of task of the chaps in the Boisgeau is amputations. There's serious wounds for both the Germans and the Poles. And you get both German and Polish medics working together. But yeah, the bit where the sort of sanctity of this as a medical place is not honoured certainly features in a lot of the Polish literature. But as I say, it's called the Zameczka, the little castle.
And the owner there used to be really good. The old French guy who was there, who must have died about 5-6 years ago, was wonderful. You could park up there and he'd show you around. He'd let you walk in the fields and show you the views back into the pocket. And the guy who lives there now, it has to be said, is not the same kind of guy. I'm not going to say anything particularly nasty about him, but he's not very welcoming. There's all red and white tape up around it. And this is regardless of the fact it's an anniversary period. There's red and white tape up all year round. He doesn't seem to like people stopping, having a look. But hey, it's important to feature and worth mentioning. I flashed up a photo on the screen earlier of the road these guys are driving. This is an image taken after battle. There's a knocked out Panther there. This is probably some time later because they're already the French cleaning up and pushing things out the way. But it shows you just what was going on this road. And some of these vehicles are being hit by artillery. Some are being hit from the Mace, from the Poles. Some may be running out of fuel. Some are, being strafed by aircraft. There's all sorts of things going on here. But that's the road the camera teams are driving, and they will carry up the hill, and we'll see where they can park next. I'm hoping they can get to a particular field we'll talk about later. If there's vehicles there parked, we'll see what we can do. But they're pushing. At least we've got a signal. That's good. So yeah, if you can carry on talking about the state of play, Jenny, and how things are going on the 19th and 20th, and which are the key moments, because we're coming up the sort of the edge of the perimeter, because it was a very small. Some books say the whole Polish defense was like a kilometer square, so they're compacted into quite a small area, partly because of the steep slopes around. There's certain ways of approach. There's no way the Germans can come, so they can concentrate on those two roads you mentioned. So if you want to elaborate on their positions and what's going on, that'd be brilliant while we're driving.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Poles are to the north of the Mace. The plan originally was to take, as I say, you've got these two hills, Hill 262 in the north and Hill 262 in the south, and then you've got the D16 between. The aim was for the first Armoured Regiment to go and secure both of them. But as they arrive at the D16, this is where they see the front of this German column. We're talking staff cars, guns drawn by 6 horses. We've got, I mean, all sorts going along there in no particular order. And the Savini's point was we were concealed in this woodland and we declare fire. And for half an hour, I think that the phrase that's used by Paul Woodadge is it's a target-rich environment. They just blow the hell out of this. Now, obviously, they have no choice about doing this, but it does mean that their objective of crossing that road and then securing this more southern point is blown out of the water, mainly because you've got this absolute charred mess of material and so forth blocking this road, but also the visibility is now zero because you've got sort of ammunition burn. I mean, everything's on fire. So and once it gets to nightfall, you can see absolutely nothing. So they're no longer able to take these 2 points that are controlling it. And whether they'd have been able to hold it, split the force that holds Hill 262 north and actually divide that between the 2 points is dubious, particularly as the Germans, as you say, they then split their forces. So they go along the D16 or they take the more northerly route and past Kudaha. So by the time we get to the end of the 19th, we've got our sort of order of battle in place. We've got our armoured regiments. We've got our anti-tank guns. They are expecting Buttrick's sort of counterattack the next day. So the 20th is described as the day of crisis by Maczek. So you have attacks from the morning, from the east, from the west, from the north primarily, of these various groups. And the Poles, we talk about the desperation. Up to this point, the Poles have not slept for 3 days. Kosciuszki, there was Allied bombing. They've blown up half his fuel reserves. He was already on low petrol to begin with. One of the key points that is a problem for the Poles is that they are isolated, not just from reinforcements or artillery support that's meaningful given the absolute mess of forces on there, but they don't have an evacuation route for the wounded or prisoners, and they don't have any supplies coming through. And there's a number of reasons for this. If I can quote Kitching, because General Kitching's quite an interesting character. He is ordered by Simmons to go and engage with the Germans, with Buttrick's Corps, in order to take some of the pressure off the Poles, and he just doesn't. He says he couldn't find who he was supposed to engage with, and is then fired. So there's pretty bad blood between Maczek and Kitching. Now, Kitching's phrase is describing the Poles. He says, "To hell with them. They have run out of food and ammunition because of the inefficiency of their organization. Our people have been fighting just as hard, but we have managed to keep up our supply system." And there is very much an element where the Poles, again, whether it's cultural, where they just seem happier, flying without a safety net, basically. And they will move into these areas knowing that they don't have a supply train. I know Eddie Florentin refers to a sort of Canadian unit where they say, our ambulance, our supplies are 48 hours behind us due to the sort of speed in which everything is developing. So they may have to pause. And this isn't something that occurs to the Poles. The only limited factor is if they lack the fuel for their vehicles. So this is the situation. They are cut off from the Canadians because they're 18 kilometers to the north. The Americans aren't able to come through because you've still got these sort of German attacks holding. Chambois is still very, very active on the 20th, obviously. And then you've got issues with airdrops where they're dropping them behind German lines. So the Poles are holding out now for 3 days. So when we get to the 20th, I know you want to sort of discuss the battle later.
No, it's all good. Don't worry. What you're doing is great.
No, it's fine. So if I can just find my little
there's a Kubelwagen there just gone past. So there are still some Germans trying to get out of the pocket by the look of it. They're a bit late, 76 years late, but they finally made it past the Poles. Well done them.
If you read Pierre Savini's account, then he quotes Major Stefanovic. Now, when we're talking about the desperation of the Poles, they have a couple of distinct advantages in that position. They are uniquely motivated, as we've discussed. They're also uniquely experienced. So Major Stefanovic, who's with the 1st Armoured Regiment, he has been the lead in training Poles in tank doctrine, tank manoeuvres since the 1920s. He's studied at the French equivalent of a tank college. He's been an observer for the Spanish Civil War. He is as experienced a man as you could get in that particular position. These men have fought through Poland, through France, and so forth. And particularly if you compare it to somebody like Kitching, for example, who's 33, and he is the divisional commander for the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, who has zero combat experience before he gets to Normandy. He's actually been in the British Army until 1938 when he moves over to the Canadian Army. So you can see like the difference in the sort of quality of the personnel. Yeah. I know somebody quoted that, war is very good for promotion. That facility doesn't really exist to the same degree for the Poles. When you've got the Polish Armed Force in the West, there is only so much upward manoeuvre that you can get to. So Maczek is, if not the oldest, I mean, one of the oldest divisional commanders in the Allied forces. He's of the same cohort as Patton of Eisenhower, born in 1892. So the guys on the Mace, their commanders have got 10 years on their Allied counterparts. If I quote Stefanovic, and again, I love Savini's account, don't get me wrong, but there is an element of, he's going for the tears, and he's saying, at the end of the 19th, he says, that the major gathers his men around and says, "Gentlemen, the hour is grave. The brigade is completely isolated. The enemy is still fighting. His only escape routes are those you see to the right and left. There is nobody except us who can stop them. Surrender is out of the question as Poles. The infantry will hold the lower ground and will withdraw to the higher ground only in the last resort. The tanks will remain here with engines stopped to save petrol." So you get a sense there, obviously, of the shortage of the fuel. We've got one of the interesting ways that the forces are sort of deployed along this is that you have sort of tanks and anti-tank guns and infantry sort of dug in between them, but also further down the slope. And so Savini's, I love the role of the forward observation officer. And so he's got his own Sherman that he uses to communicate with the artillery and with Stefanovic, sorry. But he's also, at one point, he's found in a hedge, he's up a birch tree somewhere else. So another advantage the Poles have, apart from this massive amount of experience, motivation, is that they can call on this coordinated artillery. I don't know if we've spoken in the other programs, but the Allies are much, much better at coordinating this. So it's not, although we get to the point of some units having to pull out bayonets, for example, the mortar platoon runs out of mortars and they're fighting as infantry. But you've got anti-aircraft guns on there, you've got anti-tank guns there, you've got the tanks, and they're actually able to coordinate. And one of the key points about this position, I mean, we've talked about Kudahar Chapel that we're seeing later, is it's seen as a chapel where you can see 17 steeples. Savini is talking about from the top of Montormel. You could see the fighting at Chambois, at Saint-Lambert-Sedive. I mean, this just dominates this entire sort of region. So yes, there's a desperation in that there aren't supplies coming and they don't know when they're going to arrive. And you do have this very fortunate element where the Germans, basically their attempt to escape runs out of steam by the time the Poles are reinforced. But they do have this advantage of this very, very coordinated attacks, and which is part of the reason why the Polish sort of casualties are relatively manageable. I mean, it's when we talk about Stalingrad, they lose, a fifth of the men there are killed, 2/3 are wounded. By the end of the second day, Stefanovic himself has been wounded by a splinter shell. So you're happy for me to sort of read his quote for the second day.
Yeah, please.
He says, "Gentlemen, all is lost. I do not think the Canadians can relieve us." They've been told the Canadians will be relieving them, but this hasn't materialized. "I give you my thanks. You have fought well. Tonight we will be dying for Poland and civilization. Carry on with the same tactics. Afterwards, it will be every tank for itself, and then every man for himself." And you can see that there is the inevitable logic of what happens when you run out. I mean, you've still got communications in place, but what happens when you literally have no more ammunition? These men have fallen asleep with sort of panzers yards from them. They're utterly broken, utterly exhausted, and they have no way of knowing who is coming to their rescue. So that's when we get to the sort of third day, which is when the Canadians finally break through. Savini refers to the end of the second day as the top of the hill being surrounded by a rampart of bodies. When the Canadians break through, they talk about this battlefield strewn with bodies and parts of bodies. And again, you've got these poor chaps who've been wounded from both sides, with very limited medical supplies, who are under constant bombardment. You've also got the prisoners, so you can surrender. You do get quite a few cases of Poles who've been conscripted into the Wehrmacht surrendering and switching sides and here have a rifle. But the Germans that surrender and that they're put in a sort of a field, it's very loosely guarded field called the Polona. And that obviously is subject to bombardment as well. So it wasn't necessarily that you were then in safety. Have you made this decision to surrender to the Poles, which they do?
So I'm just going to explain where the camera teams are now, because this is the my favorite part of one of my favorite parts of Normandy, to be honest. And the monument there that Duncan is looking at now is commemorating the if you like, symbolic handshake between elements of the Canadian Grenadier Guards and the Polish forces 76 years ago today in this location. That's what that monument has been honoring for however long it's been there, 20, 30 years. But actually, more interesting than this ceremonial handshake was the fact there was a massive, great battle that took there, because that is the battlefield. If you can pan around, Duncan, to show the woods behind you. So essentially, as I understand the location, the other way down, your left, the Grenadier Guards left. No, you're Scots Guards, are you, Duncan? I know, yeah, you're Scott. Well, that tree line there is kind of where the poles are. If you pan around further to the left, show the other side of the road, Duncan. Left, 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 left. Yeah. So the other side of the road over there, that kind of hill over there, that's where Bittrick's forces are coming from. There's some German Fallschirmjäger over there trying to keep this pocket open. So this is kind of the front line. This road here is very much a front line. If you show down the road back towards Saint-Lambert, Duncan, so that the viewers get an idea of which way the Germans are coming. So if the Germans are going to get out of the pocket, they've got to come up this road and they've got to fight their way past this position, which, as Jenny said, has got anti-tank guns, Sherman tanks, anti-aircraft guns, mortars, all kind of together in that hedgerow there. And this is where this epic battle took place. It's one of my favorite locations. And Jenny's going to explain some of the events of what happened. I'm going to show it while Jenny's talking. I've got 4 photos of that field there that I'm going to flash up. So, Jenny, can I explain what was happening there on that critical day, the 20th and 21st of August?
Right. So one of the advantages that the Poles have is that the Germans are not able to coordinate their attacks meaningfully. You've got this Bittrick's forces are going to come from the east. That's been planned for 3 days. He wanted to, resupply with fuel and so forth. You've also got elements where you've got sort of the paratroopers, where you've got these sort of units that are brought together from different units that they put together. And then you've got sort of individuals by themselves. So it's very, very sparse. On this particular day, then, the Germans come very close to breaking through, by which I mean their aim is to split the Polish forces from themselves, isolate them so that they are the ones that are then encircled more than they are already. And then create the space for the rest of the 7th Army to come through. So you end up with attacks from the northwest, attacks from the east, and Bittrick's forces coming through. And you've got the amazing sort of quote by Kosciuszki. So this is Kosciuszki, who's the commander of the 1st Armoured Regiment. I hope I got that one right. And I mean, I was going to read out the same quote that I heard you reading on the Dan Hill.
Yeah, please do.
Because you have to. So he's talking about, you've got obviously tanks coming within range of tanks, barrel to barrel engagements. And then you've got infantry trying their best just to climb over the back of the tanks to get rid of them. I'm going to give you the slightly abridged version. He's talking about tanks engaged targets to their front with their guns. Their crews had to fire hull and turret machine guns at the enemy infantry attacking from the rear. Tank commanders joined their defense, firing their pistols as Germans tried to clamber aboard their vehicles. All of the regiment's machine guns at the same time, all of the turret machine guns in both directions, 44 tank guns and around 90 machine guns. And then he's talking about the intensity of this advance. So we're talking it's sort of Panzer Mark 4s, a couple of Panthers in there. But you've got these sort of reams of infantry coming through into the range of these guns. So he's talking of our losses mounted constantly. The Boche were advancing towards us singing. We let them come to within 50 yards, then we mowed down their ranks. More waves followed. When the 5th came, we were out of ammunition. The Poles charged them with bayonets. During the day, we suffered 8 attacks like this. And then about 6 o'clock, the attacks ceased. The battlefields were a scene from a nightmare. Thousands of corpses made a veritable rampart. One of the elements that's not discussed so much, but certainly I know there's Robert Barr on Twitter, his father fought here. He's talking about one of the more distressing elements is the role of the Hitler-Jugend division, which is these fanatical teenagers. We describe them as being radicalized today. And their officers are drawn from the SS. So absolutely elite, motivated, fanatical groups. But teenagers, and they're talking about the Poles on average are slightly older in age profile than the other allies due to the nature of recruitment and so forth. And they are having to shoot teenage boys on bayonet teenage boys who have no intention of surrendering. And obviously there's no other option available to them. But this is one of the things that sort of stays with the Poles who survived this years later. Wow. And that they had to dispatch these kids, which is pretty. Wow.
I just want to reference the track the team are driving down now, because it's a shortcut I use when I'm on tour to get from that field where the monument is through to Montormel. But the fact is, it was a usable track in 1944, and it's one of the ways where Maczek can relocate and resupply with his limited supplies back and forth. It's nice and safe. There is no German air power in the air anyway, and that track that kind of runs along the ridge is a really good way of moving troops back and forth. And I can't imagine how many troops ran up and down that. We didn't mention earlier, we should mention the fact that although, in my opinion, the American 90th Division are a bit of a weak link in this engagement. I don't think they kind of do brilliant stuff down in Bourg Saint-Léonard, but they do when they link up with the Poles in Chambord. They give them fuel and ammunition. They give them 130 tank shells and several thousand rounds of machine gun ammunition, which become vital for that account you read a minute ago, when all the battalion's machine guns are firing backwards and forwards in that field we were just at. So that, if nothing else, the ammunitions they received from the Americans were vital for this 3-day battle to be able to keep on going. But this track there, you don't want to be driving this in the winter, folks. If you come to Normandy in the winter, you don't want to be driving it then. You'd get stuck. But in the summer, it's fine. As I said, there are ceremonies taking place. We're hoping by taking this track, they'll end up kind of bypassing any kind of roads on the problems on the road. But we'll see what happens. They'll be getting down to the chapel de Coudehard fairly soon, and we can carry on the story there and show some views from there. And then we'll see what happens when they get to the monument. There was a ceremony taking place at 4 o'clock, so it started 45 minutes ago. So we may catch some of that. We may not be able to access quite so well. I don't know. But anyway, this track is a wonderful way of driving down and getting an idea of Maczek's defense. They're just coming up to the chapel now. So they're turning down. That's across towards that. That's outside the pocket. That's across to where Bittrick's forces. That's running across kind of directly parallel to the image there is the Vimoutier Road, the D16. So that is where some of the forces are. So they're now at the top of the track there. And I'll let Jenny explain the significance of this chapel which is a great little location, and the view from there is stunning. So they're coming into there now. So I'll hand over back to you, Jenny. It's all brilliant stuff. I'm enjoying this show so much. No offense to Sean and David for the earlier two shows, but this one is the one I was really looking forward to.
So with the chapel, this is one of the first places that is actually secured by the Poles. And then sort of they dig in around it. I'd say it's Kudahar Chapel. It dates from the 13th century for those of us interested in such matters. But this is the one where it's talked about. It's the chapel where you can see the 17 steeples. So this position is absolutely vital for them maintaining visibility over this region. And obviously, by its nature, it's a particularly sort of strong target as well for the Germans. So I think I've seen plenty of photographs. I haven't visited the chapel itself, much to my shame. There's still pretty good evidence, which hopefully we can see, of the actual sort of damage done to it.
So Duncan's going to be showing, I think, some of the views. Well, he's got a little viewing platform, and we'll also get across how steep some of the slopes are there. And although later on we'll have hopefully even better views from Montormel itself, the actual memorial there and the monuments there, but even from here, you can understand it's not quite the highest point in Normandy. There's the hill in Mortain is higher. There's Montpinçon, but it's about the third or fourth highest hill in Normandy. 262, of course, referring to 262 meters above sea, and that's the view out back to where the Germans had come from. That forest on the horizon there is the Forêt de Goffran, where the Germans have been gathering in the sort of the days August 15, 16, 17, prior to this push to get out of the pocket. And you can see why, for the Polish observers, this chapel was an ideal location to set up. I didn't know the 17 church towers quote. That makes perfect. If I did know, I'd forgotten it. And while that's the view of Duncan, Mag should be actually showing us the church itself. There's a monument which we found ourselves the first time for the recce. It only went up last year for the 75th. And not being able to read Polish, I'm not exactly sure. It says in French as well, but that is to, well, I'll let Jenny explain who that's to.
Yeah, so I mean, as it says, it's in memory of the soldiers of the Podhalion Brigade, this infantry group on the 75th anniversary of the fighting on. Well, I mean, this hill has about 18 different names, isn't it? I mean, we talk about Hill 262. You've got Montormel. In French, it's Mace, which is in Maczek's sort of autobiography. For the Poles, it's called Maczuga. And
just to interrupt, we just asked where the chapel is. So in this Google Earth image, it's right in the middle there, basically, and under the 2 of 262. There's the track that runs down, straight down there is where it comes out. So chapel is about there. So it's right in the middle of the position. So I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, absolutely. Sorry, I was just trying to give a bit of background into why it's called the Mace or the Maczuga and so forth. So this idea is that Maczek's got a very good understanding of sort of psychology. He doesn't like giving map references. He likes clearly identifiable names. So when he talks about in Chambois, he refers to it as the little cross. That's our objective. Here he talks about Maczuga because it looks like sort of the two sort of rounded ends. Sorry, I'm doing hand gestures, which nobody.
I'll put you on screen. I'll put you on screen so you can do your gesture now. Do your gesture now. No, you've done it now. You've got to do it now. Do your gesture.
Sorry. So you've got these two sort of round areas. You've got Hill 262 north and Hill 262 south, and then a sort of ridge between it. And the idea is that it looks like a sort of medieval mace. So as I say, in Polish it's Maczuga, in French it's Mace, we call it the Mace, or Hill 262, or Montormel, and these are all sort of names that are
or Kudahar, yeah. So well, that's that view there. So we're lucky. The weather is amazing today, so that's great. It's not too hot for the cameras. The signal is perfect from there, as you'd expect, being so high up. The chapel there. I urge you, if you're coming to Normandy, you can either take that track we drove ourselves from the link-up position between the Guards and the Polish, or you can go up the track from the other direction from the Montormel Memorial, and you can look from there. But yeah, do take the time to go there. Don't just do the memorial itself. Walk up the chapel, because it's definitely worth it for the view alone. In the winter, if you come in the winter, you can see through the trees better. You can see the terrain in some ways better. So it's also worth having a look in the winter. So brilliant stuff. So that's the chapel there. And when we talked about that desperate action back in the field earlier on, with all the regiments, machine guns firing at the same time, and the fear of Germans climbing on your own tank hull. I think to me, that's when I don't have hairs on my head, but if I had, the metaphorical hairs on my head would be standing on end. And when I take group, Dave Collins, who's watching the show, he's been down there with me to Falaise Gap. When I read that account of the machine guns firing and them knocking out tanks, and I'll show that image again because I don't know that I referenced it when it was on screen. One of my favorite photos of the Gap. And now you do have to wonder whether one of that Sherman tank may have rolled down the slope a bit. And there's actually two vehicles to right there. It's very confusing when you first see that image. There is a Panther, and in front of the Panther is a half track. So these two panels here are the driver's visors on the half track, and then behind it is a Panther. So you've got a Sherman tank there, the Polish, and you've got a Panther and a half track. Now, if anyone's watching this who's a former tank, I know Gareth Davies has watched my show. I know there's other people who've served their country. That's not how you learn to engage tanks in the Royal Tank Regiment. That's, you're not meant to engage 10 foot apart. That's what happens in this battle here, where things are so close that they're in danger of their own, being overrun by people standing on the vehicles. I mean, just incredible stuff. And I was saying that we desperately need some really good English language books about the Poles on the Mace, because there just isn't enough information that hasn't been filtered through either British or Canadian historians. We want the Polish version to come shining through. And so, Jenny, I'm looking to you to do some of that work in the future. So what an amazing view, folks. This is exactly what we're trying to do with World War II TV, is to bring these live images 76 years on to the day this link up occurred. This is when the pocket was closed 76 years ago today. So fantastic imagery there from our camera team. So I'll let Jenny carry on talking about the chapel again, and then I'll have the guys move on to the memorial itself, because they've got us another 10 minutes or so to go. So I'll hand over to Jenny for talking, and the guys, guys, I guess you can move on now. Move on to Montormel and see what happens with getting there and what's going on with ceremonies and parking. And brilliant shots, guys. Well done. Fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, one of the key elements we have here is the very fact that the Poles are fielding an armoured division, and this is something they've been pushing for since they arrived in Britain. The sort of stereotypes that we get of the Polish facing the Germans in 1939 as sort of German tanks being met with cavalry is just so insulting to the state of Polish military training, to their engineering institutes. So there's a beautiful moment in 1919 where have I frozen? I froze. I don't know.
No, it's all good.
No, good. Okay, fine. There's in 1919, Poland has a brief moment where it fields the fourth largest armored force in the world. And bearing in mind the Treaty of Versailles has forbidden, obviously, the Central Powers from having tanks, which contributes significantly. They've got these FTs, I apologise, which is basically the core of their tank units through the 1920s. By the time they come to the early 1930s, they begin to shop around. They're looking at the well, I've gone blank. I'm sorry. They're looking at British tanks. So they're looking at the Vickers Mark E, which they buy in. They get a production license. They're focusing on building the sort of 70p. They buy some of the sort of Renault 35s as a stopgap. As things are heating up in sort of 38, that they appreciate that they can't wait until they've engineered the perfect tank. So they're buying these as an emergency. But the forces that actually invade, this idea that the Germans are coming with this sort of invincible panzer divisions, actually Panzer 1s, Panzer 2s for the vast majority, and they're taken out by both those anti-tank guns that the Polish possess. And if you read Roger Morehouse's book, he talks about where this idea of the cavalry charge at Kraunte occurs, which was essentially a move to sort of divert pressure away from another unit. But they decided to do it on horses. Up to this point, the cavalry are transformational. They're becoming basically sort of mounted infantry. Although you've still got the elan of the cavalry. And Maczek himself, he's only appointed the previous year to the motorized cavalry brigade, and he's an infantryman himself. He's not sure. So his first speech, he talks about basically, right, chaps, you can have all this bravado that comes with being in the cavalry, but you need to show me its worth in blood on the battlefield. So it's very sort of transitional. And as you say, you do have the cavalry, this sort of officer elite, as you had with all of the countries. When they come to France, they're given the blasted FTs again to train on, and they're only given the sort of 35s and 40s later, when it's too late, when they're asked to field a division, and they say, well, we can put together a brigade at this point. But that's too late. This is June 1940. When they get to Britain, to Scotland, this is the first time that they feel they've been taken seriously. They don't have a good experience in France. They are not looked after, invested in, valued. They are seen as a defeated nation by and large, and the failings are theirs, obviously. So when they get to Britain, they're given lorries, which is quite a big deal. Not that they didn't have lorries in Poland, but in huge numbers that you can then use for sort of going to the rifle range for doing various exercises. And they're given tanks. So they're given Valentines, they're given Churchills, they're given Covenanters, eventually they're given the Shermans, and later the Cromwells. So Maczek's man tank is a Cromwell, the 10th Mount. Sorry, these shots are amazing.
I know, there's a lot of reenactors there. Mostly, just to interrupt, they're mostly dressed as French Second Armoured. I haven't seen any Poles yet. These are mostly dressed as French Second Armoured, which is not inappropriate. They were, I guess, about 10 miles down the road, maybe a bit less. But it's good to see that
we're just all in the hedgerow, my friend. That's fine. We are concealed.
It's good to see that the fact that people are honouring this anniversary. So there's a half track there. That's in French markings as well, by the look of it. Yeah, I think so. So obviously the camera teams have to walk their way through the crowds and hope they can get somewhere. And it's all exciting stuff. These are the live events that we're getting that we weren't expecting. And huge numbers of reenactors there. I'm really impressed.
I mean, if we talk about the Poles and Canadian sort of relationship,
yeah, definitely. We're going to do that at some point anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Savini's sort of medium artillery regiment has been sort of embedded with the Poles, and since they start off at Totalized Tractable, they are French speaking. They're from Quebec, and they got on really, really well because the French officer class are taught. Quite a lot of French officers teach. And Warsaw, you're expected to study French as an officer, for example. There's a great scene when they get to Breda. Hello, chaps. When they get to Breda for Christmas.
I think they're meant to be Poles, aren't they? Yeah, good. Sorry, I'm interrupting you. Yeah.
No. So when it gets to Breda, and the French and the Polish officers all have a very merry time, and they process in single file with a drink in one hand around this room. Singing French and Polish carols, and it, there's an element where you had to be there, but it does sound like they get on very well. In contrast to, I would say, the Polish attitudes to Simmons. Certainly, there's anger with the 4th Canadian Armoured Division that they didn't support them. If you read the report that's written just a couple of days later, it's very much talking about we were the front of the wedge, we were alone, we were isolated. We were not supported by these Canadians. And then
sorry to interrupt you, to which the Canadian response would be that the Poles didn't come to the rescue of the Worthington force a week earlier. So I'm not taking sides in this, but
no, absolutely.
There have been some instances in the week before this that have led towards some issues, shall we say.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then you get for the next 20 years when people are beginning to write their memoirs. Certainly the Canadian accounts are pretty hostile to the Polish contribution. And this is where you get into one of the sort of the tragedies of the Poles afterwards. Maczek famously has his Polish citizenship stripped from him. He becomes a barman in Edinburgh. Kosciuszki, who's on the Mace, he ends up working in a laundry in Devon. He then sort of emigrates to Brazil later. Stevanovic, he actually emigrates to Canada, which I find very sweet, actually. But when we're talking about, Simmons goes on to be sort of the Canadian Chief of Staff, for example, when his, judgment comes out compared to that of a barman in Edinburgh, Maczek writes his memoirs, but they're published in Polish and in French and not in English. He's not particularly confident in his English, presumably doesn't think there's much of a market. And not only is it that there's nothing coming out from the Polish community in Britain, who are all, working their socks off to support their families, but actually in Poland, that's now controlled by the communists, there's very little recognition given to the Poles either. You get sort of Skabinski, who is very, very close to Maczek, goes back to Poland. The officers tend to fall under suspicion. So in the 50s, he's actually handed a death sentence. But his writings, although it's incredibly well written, are actually sort of quite critical of a lot of the Poles, because the communist propaganda, the Russian propaganda that's coming into Britain as well through this period, is that the Poles were imperialists, they were effectively fascists, and they were anti-Semite. And there's all of this sort of propaganda that's sort of trying to play down the role of this idea that the Poles that, you know, went to Britain were this elite, and that actually they didn't represent the true proletarian soul of Poland. So unfortunately, the Polish story is not really getting any traction until we talk about the past 20 years. So we've got Polish communities in Edinburgh, largely. I mean, throughout Britain, you know, they settle and then they go off to Canada, to Australia for new lives. But there's people whose parents went through this and then got very little recognition as they then have to adapt to civilian lives. And the British government, the Labour government, passes a law under pressure from the unions, saying that these Poles that come over, they cannot compete with Brits. So although there's job vacancies in areas like textiles and mining, that's okay. But if you're, you know, if you're Maczek, I mean, what exactly is your skill set beyond being a military instructor, which you're not invited to do with limited English? So yeah, we've got certainly a sense where I think the Polish story of 262 needs to be gotten out. I think there's still an element where a lot of this is told through the filter of national history, and that there needs to be much more of a fusion of the Canadian and Polish perspectives of 262, where the Polish account is often just sort of repeated and not necessarily dug into to the degree that it perhaps needed to be. Wow, look at this.
Yeah, well, they told me before they went online, there are 4 buses of Polish veterans, obviously modern veterans, not World War II. And there's obviously a big delegation there for the ceremony. So, I mean, I hope Duncan is such a nosy Parker. He's not going to get.
He's done well, hasn't he?
But yeah, well, he just walks in. That's Duncan's way. Mag's being all French and holding back and being polite, and Duncan just walks in. So, well, if he gets arrested, he gets arrested. But yeah, it's glad to see there's some recognition going on, and I'm amazed how big the event is. They build a little stadium there and everything. So clearly, obviously, folks, we're not going to go up and video the memorial itself. But hey, at least we're getting this great footage of a live ceremony, so it's all good. So yeah, no, I mean the Poles. I'm so grateful that you've come on board to tell us about the Poles, because it's the area of the battle, or the aspect of the battle that my knowledge is just so poor on, because there's just that little available, and what is available, I sense, is kind of, you know, filtered through racism. That's a strong word to use, but just, yeah, the way they interpret these same events. Yeah, the Poles saying the Canadians didn't come to their aid, and the Canadians saying the Poles hadn't come to their aid previously, and these things are interesting. These things are oh, that's good. We'll play that for a minute or two. Well, that's amazing stuff.
Wow, well done you. That's brilliant.
Anyone would think we planned that. And that was the Polish national anthem. I've been reminded by Dave Collins. I wouldn't recognize the Polish national anthem, I'm afraid. It's not one of the ones in my radar. But yeah, so and I've got a question from Mike Bechtold here, who's one of my regulars, the Canadian historian, saying, what about the Americans? Why did they stop? And I think that's another subject we could talk about for a long time. But I have to say, and I said in my lecture for Dan Hill for his wonderful History from Home lectures, I did one on Falaise Gap about 10 days ago. I think all this, the blame about whether it should be Bradley, Monty, this, that, and the other. I think the underperforming unit nearby is the American 90th Division. And it's not that I'm being critical of the individuals within that division. It was mainly a command problem. They've been through 4 commanders since D-Day. Their new command they've had at this point, they've had for 2 weeks, and he's not had a chance to influence the division yet. And they do end up, the American 90th Division, being a very, very good unit. But I think when you look at where they are deployed near Bourg Saint Leonard and how close they were to Moisy Fort, how close they were, I think when you think how desperate the Poles were fighting, how desperate the Canadians and Saint-Lambert, and you read the accounts of the 90th Division, I'm not sure they really kind of gave their all like the Poles and the Canadians. I know there's Americans watching this, and there are some American units that are fantastic in Normandy, and the 90th do become a better unit later on, but I think in Normandy they are a bit underperformers. What's your take on that, Jenny?
I'm going to say I'm reading this more from the Polish perspective, and
right, yeah.
The Canadians are the ones that they sort of reserve their ire for. The French come into quite a lot of criticism as well for holding back. The Americans less so, interestingly, but I'd say this is mainly Maczek's perspective, and I need to read a little bit more widely. And what I would say is, I mean, we were looking at the ceremony, and you know, the sort of the French veterans that the sort of the gratitude is something that really stays with the Poles. By the time we get to sort of the following spring, 1945, and Yalta, they know they're not going home, and they're going and liberating French towns and Belgian towns. And everybody's surprised that the Poles would be there. So you've got cases where they're taking French flags and ripping off the blue bit and turning them sideways. And then you've got a very, you know, a functional sort of Polish flag. As they're coming into towns, you've got people sort of dragging somebody to the side saying, right, how do we say welcome in Polish, or thank you, so witamy and dziękujemy. And they're sort of hastily sort of producing these. So this is one of the things that really sort of stays with Maczek. And certainly Breda, obviously, which we come to sort of in the autumn, which is also where they there's 2 elements, which is why it's particularly important. Is it's where the Poles winter, but it's also this beautiful medieval town that they managed to take without the destruction that we see, say at Falaise or Chambois, without that sort of bombardment. But the Maczek comes out with this fabulous quote, which is, the Pole fights for the freedom of other nations, but dies only for Poland. So this is one of the tragedies we're talking about, is when the Poles are fighting. They have this absolute, you know, sort of desperate motivation. We've talked about the Warsaw Uprising. They've lost their homeland. They're about to be signed away for Yalta. Most of these chaps won't be able to go home, but they carry on fighting. So Maczek then talks about when he meets up with Simmons, he talks about Crerar, he talks, sorry if I said that wrong, he talks about meeting up with Monty, and they all want to know whether the Poles will still fight once they know what the terms of Yalta are. So the Poles really are, there is a tragedy to this. I mean, Hill 262 absolutely stands out, this sort of monument of sort of resilience and pure guts. And these guys are never thanked properly or recognized for the rest of their lives. And I think that has to be remembered, as well as the bravery of the troops on those 3 days.
Well, definitely. And they've got a point from Sheldrake 6 on YouTube that with regards to the Americans and 90th Division, were they in communication with the Poles? And the chances are probably they weren't. And as David O'Keefe said in the earlier show, we're in a situation where probably all the information coming through is 12, 24, maybe even 36 hours out of date. So they're getting stuff too late. To, you know, this whole battle takes 3 days to take place, which sounds a long time when you're a Polish mortarman dug in a foxhole. But in the grand scheme of the Normandy campaign, 3 days out of 76 is very short. So, the national anthem. Oh, I think Mag's muted herself. No. Well, beautiful stuff. I've just shared the image of General Maczek himself there. That's him out the turret of his command vehicle, which is the same image they chose for the statue there that is of Maczek. I don't know whether they're Polish or French, those troops are standing at. Don't go too close and get shot, Duncan. We don't want to have to explain to Valerie that you've been... But yeah, that's that same statue there. And Maczek, I mean, talk about him for a second, because what a life he leaves, because he goes from the Polish Empire, the 19th century, lives through to beyond the 1980s. And was he 102, 103 when he passed? I mean, he was...
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, he's utterly phenomenal. He's born when he's part of Poland is part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He studied philology, so literature, philosophy at Lvov, and then his studies are interrupted by the First World War. He's conscripted into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then he serves in these sort of elite mountain groups in the Alps, and then later he's on the Isonzo front fighting the Italians, and then after the war he fights in there's 6 wars that the Poles then fight once the First World War has finished. So he's fighting the Ukrainians, he's fighting the Soviets, and then he decides to make his career in the military. He had the option of going back. He completes his degree once he's injured during the war. Maybe he's tempted by a sort of academia. But as I say, Poland's been reborn. It's going to need a military. 3 of his brothers have died between 1914 and 1920, including his twin brother. So I think there's very much a sense of duty to the nation that goes with that. He primarily engaged in sort of infantry. His career it's not stratospheric. He's a corporal, and when we get to I don't mean corporal. Don't do it. When we get to September 1939, he's given control of his motorized cavalry brigade, and then I think crucially, the name that his men give him is Bata, which means shepherd. One of the things that we compare sort of between him and Simmons is a young man on the make. Maczek is 51 when he's in Normandy. And he has this very sort of fatherly approach to his men. One of the reflections he makes after Chambois 262 is that these losses weren't just difficult to replace practically, but these weren't just, Tom, Dick or Harry. These were sons, these were brothers, these were cousins, these were people that you had known since France 1940. You'd been in exile together in Scotland. So yeah, it really matters, these losses to the Poles. And there is some doubt on whether the Polish division can or should continue after 262. His take is, this is as bad as it's going to get, chaps, so why would we quit now? His conscience of the Warsaw Uprising continues is, how could we sit here in the very pleasant French countryside while this, our countrymen and women are on the streets and the sewers of Warsaw, and then they then advance through sort of Belgium. They are the ones that liberate Ypres, for example, which I need my battlefield chums to make clear when all those school trips resume. They liberate towns in Holland, and then they are the ones that are given the opportunity to take surrender of Wilhelmshaven. And then there are so many Poles liberated from the camps in that region that they set up a Polish town that's named after Maczek. And then he returns to Scotland, and that's where he lives out the rest of his days. And then he's, as I think I've talked about, leads this double life that a lot of the Polish officers lead, which is during the week, it's the 9-to-5 grind of supporting your family through whatever means. So I've talked about my grandfather ends up working in a textile mill, having been an artillery officer. But at the weekends at the Polish Social Club, you refer to each other by rank. When you go to each other's funerals, this is remembered. And Maczek lives through all of this, as you say. He dies at sort of 100 and I want to say 102. And it's only when he dies that there's any sort of real sort of move to actually have him acknowledged for this memorial bench to be built in Edinburgh. And as I say, it's not just that it's unfair to Maczek and his office and his Poles, but their children and down to the third generation, this sense that they haven't been sufficiently recognised. But he is not particularly political in the same way that Anders is political. He attends commemoration events. His aim is on keeping his men together. He visits, there's a fantastic photo of him in the 60s visiting the Menin Gate, for example. So he's very active in keeping up the Polish memory. So one of the things that you see is when the Poles are liberated. This is why I like the Eddie Florentin book, is that I think because he's coming from the French historian perspective, he's not seeing the Poles as this weird outlier. He's seeing them as a fellow European country and giving them the dignity that they afford. Whereas I think you get certainly, you know, Monty's take, I mean, goodness knows, there's a reason he doesn't join the diplomatic corps. I mean, what's the quote that I've got for him here? In response to the sort of Poles making bans, he refused to think that he should be dictated to by nations who have been under the heel of Germany as to how their forces should be used is, by my way of thinking, quite wrong. He talks about, you know, with total eyes, the Poles have not displayed that dash we expected. You talked about racism, it's certainly condescension. It's
patronising if nothing else. It's not nice.
Very much a sense that, I mean, I'm hoping with my PhD to look at how the sort of the language barrier actually causes these divisions, and you know, sort of both practically and culturally. You know, most Brits don't speak Polish, and actually, interestingly, most Poles don't speak English. They'll learn French or German at school. In addition to Polish, most of them will have sort of got Russian or German anyway as a sort of legacy of the partitions. But yeah, we see when Maczek's autobiography, and he's going to Ghent, for example, he's talking about, oh yeah, and before the war, a lot of our lads were familiar because this is where they went to university. And that's their sort of, or you talk about Sosabowski of the Parachute Brigade, and he's talking about when he finally lands for Market Garden on European soil that he hasn't been to for sort of these 4 years. And there is this sense of the sort of Poles being tied into Europe and the fate of Europe in a way that you don't get a sense of with the sort of the more Western authors. So yeah, I do think the Poles need sort of rehabilitating and knitting back in. And I think actually one of the interesting elements of this Allied effort is, okay, Canadians and English are culturally very aligned. And we see this with, you know, we talked about Kitchen, who's been in the British Army and then he switches to the Canadian Army. Symonds is born in Britain, for example. Culturally, they're very, very alike. How do you tie in a non-English speaking unit? I think we possibly do a disservice to saying, you were talking about the sort of Poles and this cavalry mentality, and that's true, but there have been, you know, for 4 years, they're trying to sort of align and standardize the training, the equipment, the performance of these. They've participated in numerous exercises, so there is a sort of expectation that they're of sort of common standards, but your question is, you know, how far does that actually work? And I think there's an expectation that the officers will go ahead with it, and then that will filter through to the men. But for example, all your manuals for, you know, how does a Sherman work are produced in Polish, for example, and your officers aren't that particularly fluent in English because they don't have the time to learn the language, where actually the younger men do. So how do you get by that? And then there's the whole issue with the liaison officers. There's a dissertation by a chap called Robert Williams, who talks about the role of the liaison officers, because I mean, all of this Allied effort is underpinned by these liaison officers and translators. You know, when we get to these few days in Falaise, nobody knows where the heck they are. They are reliant on grabbing the nearest French person and asking, you know, where the heck are we? And obviously, if you speak French, like a lot of the Poles do, you have an advantage. Obviously, it doesn't work for Kosciuszki with trying to get to Chambois, you know. But yeah, so you've got all of this element of how do you practically tie in this non-English speaking group into this, and how far is the sort of cultural differences part of the Poles are this exotic other. How far is it genuinely a cultural difference and ethos? And certainly in the exercises, they talked about sort of working at this greater intensity through all Jonathan Fennell's fantastic book of Fighting the People's War. Again, you've got all the reports on Polish morale is they are sky high. The minute they get to kill a German, they are there, my friends. And that's sort of how far is it genuinely a cultural difference and ethos? And certainly in the exercises, they talked about sort of working at this greater intensity through all Jonathan Fennell's fantastic book of Fighting the People's War. Again, you've got all the reports.
I think David's got his feed. That was, we heard you twice there for some reason. I don't know what was going on. I think David's feed was doubling up or something. Mag and Duncan, how long do you want to keep filming? How are your batteries going, by the way?
I'm good, buddy. I'm just walking down the draw now down to Joe.
Okay, has Joe got out from where he was?
Yeah. We're going to do a couple of pans over the gap itself and wrap it up.
And you're going to go to the Calvaire, are you? Or I mean, don't worry if you can't. We're well into.
Yep, we'll see what we can do.
Okay, good. So well, David's joined us back for summing up, because I think we've been an hour and 20 minutes into this now, which is great. Been good stuff. The ceremony was a bonus. So so David, did you enjoy that? That was good, wasn't it? Jenny's amazing. No, we can't hear David.
I'm sure it was all good things, right?
We can't hear you for some reason, David. No audio from David. Hang on. Anyway, so yeah, Duncan's walking down to Calvaire. So I mean, we'll bring things to an end fairly soon. But you've done it. Well, I'm very impressed with how well you've covered the Polish story, and I think people watching are certainly impressed with what we've done here to get across some of this Canadian side. And I can see, as a Polish side, I can see why the French 2nd Armoured Division have a kind of a bond with the Polish Armoured Division, because they're both sort of these orphan units within their own greater forces, because 3rd Armoured Division American blame the French 2nd Armoured Division for not being in the right place. And you wonder whether the French would blame the Americans for not being in the right place. It's the same kind of similar thing going on, where there's a bit of rivalry back and forth. But can we hear you now, David?
I don't know. Can you?
Oh, we got you now. Yeah, we got you now.
You got me now.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, Jenny, congratulations. Fantastic research, without a doubt. Please keep plugging ahead on something that is so important. There's a whole bunch of things that we could probably talk about offline, because I did a lot of research on this about 12 years ago for a documentary, and I'd love to turn you on to some things, when it comes to sources and whatever else, although it sounds like you've covered, pretty much all the ground out there. So yeah, congrats on that.
So Duncan says we're going to end this show. There's a Calvaire, a French cross on the road, the D16, and I actually borrowed this photo from Jenny's Twitter feed. If I can find the damn thing, it's here somewhere. Where is the photo of the Calvaire? There we go. This is the knocked out. I think is that Stug there. In terms of the Polish losses, Jenny, you've done a lot of work on this. I mean, as you said, it wasn't quite as bad as it could have been, but it run through what was left standing after link up with the Canadian 76 years ago today.
Okay, so I mean, in terms of officers and men, I mean, if we're taking the figure of sort of 1,500 men, we've got about 300 killed, 2/3 wounded, including Stefanovich. And as I say, one of the big problems that they have is in replacing those. You've got three potential sources of recruitment. One is sort of dried up, which is trying to get Polish Americans, Polish Canadians. That hasn't worked as well as they'd hoped. You've also got groups coming from Siberia. So they're sort of through the Middle East and then arrive. Good, but a lot of them physically are in no real state to be to undergo the training, certainly to begin with. And there's a huge amount of psychological, physical rehabilitation that needs to take place. And then you've got the sort of Poles that come over from from German units as well. So from this point on, the Polish division is always going to be under strength. Maczek refers to that throughout, but there's very little that can be done about it. And certainly one of, the strategic objective of the Poles in field in a division is to have a place at the table, to be seen as being a viable fighting force. So certainly sort of complaining that they are struggling is not something that's in their interest to do. And certainly Maczek makes much more of a deal about at the end of each engagement, every town that's liberated, he lists the German losses and so forth. So it's very much about sort of proving the Polish contribution.
So I'm going to say thank you to our incredible camera teams, Joe for navigating his way, driving through all those roadblocks and deviations, Mag and Duncan for doing some incredible work there. And I'm going to switch your feed. There's the calvaire there. There's the cross there that was in that. Oh, hello, Mag. So say thank you, Mag. Brilliant work.
Thank you.
I'll let you guys head back to Bayeux now because it's I don't know what we're having for dinner later. Well, I've got beers, so that's good. But that's that calvaire there. So thank you, Duncan. It's incredible work. And then Sean has joined us as well from the Falaise show. And the four of us, the four historians, if you like, will just kind of conclude things up and wrap this up. But Duncan and Mag, I'll just let Duncan get that final. That's Mag's shot there, the Mag shot of the calvaire there, which is where that photo. I'll show the photo again. It's been slightly rejigged, the actual monument there. But that's the location there, and there's a monument and a cross. So Duncan, Mag, I'm gonna let you guys go now. So thank you very much, Duncan. Thanks. Do you enjoy it, Duncan?
Absolutely superb as usual, Paul. Fantastic show, brilliant.
Well, I'm going to drop you out, and you make your way back safely. And thanks, Joe, for driving. And I'll see you two guys later. So I'll drop you out. Thanks very much. Brilliant. Bye.
Definitely needs a pint, no doubt.
Duncan doesn't drink. Duncan does not drink. But I'll have his pint for him. I'm just going to get rid of Mag's screen. There we go. Mag. Bye, Mag. Thank you. See you later. Remove. So, yeah, Sean joined us again. So, Sean, for those watching, Sean did the Falaise town show from earlier this morning. David did the Saint Lambert show. David's a professor and author and blah, blah, blah. And Sean's a tour guide and helps out with authors and articles. And Jenny is up and coming PhD and blah, 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 and polls. And so I got the dream team for this. So with regards to Falaise Gap, I mean, just to briefly kind of run through, there's lots of, I talked about in the Saint Lambert show about whether or not it was complete victory, a hollow victory, a half a victory. It's definitely a victory, isn't it? Army Group B are by no means the force they were after this than they were before this. Sure, a lot of 9th SS and 10th SS get out and they end up fighting in a little town in Holland called Arnhem a few weeks later. But it's got to be a victory, isn't it? Sean, I'll bring you in first. I mean, from the German point of view, because you're the kind of the German expert on this, they're a shattered force after this, aren't they?
Yeah, basically. Yeah. You can hear me, yeah?
Yeah, we got
you.
Yeah.
They're knackered, basically. Because at the same time as this, don't forget, you've also got Bagration in the Eastern Front. So that's another 250,000 men over there. And so roughly 500,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in 2.5 months. Plus the Italian campaign, the air campaign, sea campaign as well. That's it. It's a disaster. And even if you got the personnel that managed to escape the Falaise Pocket, the amount of equipment left behind is irreplaceable.
I mean, the RAF reports was it 800 tanks, 1,500 guns, something, isn't it? Sorry, I interrupted you there.
Yeah, well, you got that map that shows the little dots showing where the various vehicles are were lost. And what they don't show is horse-drawn vehicles, which of course make up a huge quantity or huge portion of the German army. It's there's that loss of material. And the other thing, of course, is morale. You might have escaped the Falaise Pocket, but you now know that pretty much from now on, everything's going to be kind of on the back foot. You have to be, maybe there was some naive kind of finesse, if you like, but every sensible German, I think, would be thinking now, is not looking great. You can't walk through scenes like that and think, be all right,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And although there was obviously fight left in the German army and there were many campaigns to go, but this idea, and I think David, I'll bring you in because I think the Canadian historians in the 70s kind of were particularly responsible for this sort of writing about the underperformance of the Allied army from the Canadian point of view, and people like Max Hastings, I think, got on the bandwagon a bit, and it's taken to more recent times where us to actually appreciate what the Allies did by breaking the Army Group B. You know, two German armies were basically ground to a halt in the pocket, isn't it? So it's about time we acknowledge just what a resounding job the Allies did in the pocket. And
yeah, I think I certainly think there's, you know, room for that kind of criticism when it comes to particular individual units and perhaps some of the command structure. But overall, basically what you're seeing, and we tend to look at this, we tend to break up Normandy in a series of battles, and we tend to not to step back and take a look at the fact that the Allies, Western Allies, were able to pursue, and this is not politically correct in World War II, an attritional strategy. And they were able to truly inflict a tremendous amount of damage on the Germans. And then what you're seeing here is the inevitable outcome of that strategy. And I would argue that one of the only reasons you can pursue that is because of the kind of intelligence technologies that you have, like ultra and other types of signals intelligence, which are able then to keep an incredible account of what is happening on the German side of the hill, as opposed to World War I, where basically you were just going from theoretical numbers, and then you would just be throwing people across no man's land, hoping that you were going to grind down your enemy, and then they were eventually going to pop. Certainly, from day one, from June 6th, you have your finger on the pulse, not 100%, but you're getting an excellent view of what is happening on the other side of the hill. So therefore, you can pursue types of attritional, cautious, if you will, strategies. The idea of grinding down, this tennis over the orange approach that we discussed before. And then finally, it's going to, it's going to devolve into a battle like this once the Germans are eventually ground down and they start to weaken, and then eventually it's going to pop. And so what we've been discussing today is essentially the results of that. And so that's where we find ourselves. That disintegration of the German army at this particular point is very much paid for from June 6th all the way up to the breakout. And then now we're seeing, we're reaping the rewards of that.
And definitely, I think, but a lot of this, we'll bring things to end fair. We lost Sean. I know Sean's back in now. We do look at Normandy as if the battle was won kind of progressively and systematically. And the fact is, it was kind of stop-start. I mean, the D-Day went really well. And then it stagnates for a few weeks and the storm affects supplies. Then July is sort of stop-start a little bit with some of the operations. But this last week, last 2 weeks, if you take from Operation Lutich to 76 years ago today, things were moving really, really fast. And we kind of, if in a football analogy, maybe we've been drawing, the Allies have been drawing the match for some time, but the Allies get 2 or 3 early good goals in this last. We end up winning the Normandy campaign 5-1 or something, but it hasn't really been it's not like the match has been going our way all the time. But this last 2 weeks has been a resounding. Everything started to come together. All the tactics we've been gradually getting better and better at have been coming to fruition. The use of the air power, the use of artillery. We have been getting better at what we've been doing. So Sean, we lost you there for a minute, and connections are obviously a bit weird, but it's a victory. It's got to be a victory, isn't it? I mean, there's no other way. I will bring Jenny in as well. And despite the losses of the Allies, the Allies come out underscore from the projections before the Normandy campaign. We come out 14 days ahead of schedule because they said it was going to be 90 days, and we come out under schedule in terms of losses. So job done. I mean, what's the debate? We did it. The Allies did it. They bested a German army that was formidable, and we came out on top. So, Jenny, what's your feelings as on the aftermath of the Falaise Gap from your perspective of a Polish historian?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's sort of revisionist to be saying actually Churchill thought it was a disappointing outcome, doesn't he? He's saying we were looking for hundreds of thousands of prisoners. You've given me tens of thousands of prisoners. From a Polish perspective, actually Maczek's tactics are vindicated. What you see is a massive review of armored division tactics for the next few months, where you're adapting a much more sort of American approach. So Maczek's battle group tactics, where he's finally been freed from sort of Simmons' constraint of totalized tractable, you see the sort of evolution. So that's sort of, lessons are learned as well. It's not just that they sort of then sit on their laurels. It's what can we do to sort of, the evolution of armored doctrine through this, through the training. And then once we get to Normandy, I think it's of particular interest.
So, well, I mean, I think we've been at it an hour and a half now, so that's more than I anticipated. So, any closing comments, Sean or David, just about the Falaise Gap? And Sean, yeah, sure.
Yeah, can I just mention something? I dropped out for about a minute because of my crappy internet connection, and I missed David's show and part of Jenny's talk as well. But Jenny did mention about there's like an empathy between the French and the Poles. I think part of that you had in the Polish immigrants to this region for mining and stuff, in Normandy. But also you have that empathy between, you've got two countries who were overrun. So there's that natural kind of, they're in the same boat in a sense. And although, the Polish story has been sort of, it's been neglected to a certain extent in English literature, that museum at Montormel has been there decades, hasn't it? And today's ceremony, I didn't think it was particularly unusual. It's the same every year. You get this massive turnout for the Poles. And the other reason for that, of course, I don't know if you know the guy, Edward Podima, who's passed away, and he passed away last year. You had this guy who was, a Pole who lived in France, and after the war he stayed in France and was kind of, the face, if you like, of the Polish presence.
Yeah, he was in every documentary, every show,
every ceremony, and just a nice guy as well. He was driving around Falaise at 92 years old at about 5 miles an hour, and people were just standing out the way and letting him go past because they knew who he was. But you have that kind of, that empathy between these two countries, which I think Britain not being invaded and Canada being, of course, across the Atlantic, don't necessarily have the same kind of feeling towards what happened.
And leading off from that, Sean, I think we should just mention for those who come to Normandy, the Polish graves are not really anywhere near the Falaise Gap. They're right up near a coin in Urville. The reason for the Polish cemetery being there is because they chose to put it near a Polish community of miners working in the quarries and the mines south of Caen. So they're a good 20 miles away, I suppose, from where they fell. Well, some of them would have died in the totalized tractable campaign, but the ones who died on the Mace, they're buried 20 miles away. And I remember when I was first coming to Normandy in the 80s, the businesses in Urville, the village, they still had Polish names. The French village, the boucherie and the boulangerie had Polish names. They're now, you don't see anything Polish there on the names anymore, but I'm sure they're now 3rd, 4th, 5th generation Polish. But that's why the Polish cemetery is 20 miles away, in case you're wondering, folks, why it's not right near the Mace there. And we also, to touch on as well, and this is something the Montormel Memorial did, the directors and the staff there do this very moving presentation about the aftermath of walking that area with the handkerchiefs over your mouths for months, if not years, after this battle. The millions of flies that were over there, the recovery of the dead, the recovery of the horses, the animals, the livestock, the pollution of the rivers, the pollution of the wells, the drainage, all that there, that was a massive, great deal for the French. And so we talk about that on all the shows. We try and talk about the French experience. So I think we've done a pretty good job on that. I'm going to look back and think we did quite well. So David, our Canadian here, we've got Brits, Canadians, and Sean and I live in France. How do the Canadians look on the Battle of the Falaise Pocket these days? I mean, the modern generation, has there been a mindset of change now when you teach it? Is it give us your take on how it's viewed 2020?
Yeah, I think one of the problems with a historical event like this is, we're always looking for, the absolute worst of the absolute best. And I think with this, probably incomplete victory is probably about the best way I can put it. In other words, there were mistakes made. It was a victory. There's no doubt about it. Could it have been better? My God, yeah, without a doubt. So I think it's just a question of trying to calibrate it properly. Making sure that we don't go too far one way or the other in that. So that's part of the challenge of being a historian when you're dealing with Falaise. But I mean, what I liked about today's discussion, particularly with the Poles, there's so many questions, more questions about the relationship between the Poles and the Canadians, whether it be on the field of battle or later on in the historiographical realm, which I think really need to be discussed. So, I mean, obviously Jenny's doing fantastic work at her end. It would be nice to see some young historians, whether they be Canadian or otherwise, certainly pick up the torch and run with it.
No, definitely. And Jenny, any final words before we end the stream?
I really don't know. So, I mean, it was just wonderful that we could get to the ceremony. That was an unexpected bonus.
It was like I planned it, and yet I didn't. I cannot take any credit for that whatsoever. It all just fell into place. And I noticed Mag was doing her bluffing her way in through in French. I think she played some "We're part of the press" card, I think, which is fine. I don't care what lines they use to get there. And Duncan just walks in. So that was great to get that. And for people, you know, that there's this, I see on Facebook quite often that because of COVID, there's nothing going on in France. The French have forgotten about the anniversary. Absolutely not. The ceremonies in some cases are smaller, less people at them, but they're all still happening. Every village has done its usual thing with their usual flowers and wreaths and ceremonies. It's just been not quite as big as the big year. And last year, of course, with the 75th was a big one. So inevitably it's going to be smaller this year. But anyway, I'm going to bring things to an end. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you very much, Jenny. I had a really good time. And hopefully those watching had a reasonably good time as well. There have been some cracking conversations going on, as always, on YouTube. But I always think if pretty much every Canadian historian seems to be watching my feeds now. Everyone of note, there's Mike and Alex Black, and everyone is watching it. So that's fantastic. So in terms of housekeeping, I haven't actually put up any new shows yet. I have got shows coming up September the 11th. Norbake, the first attack into the Netherlands by the American 30th Division. Got a show on that with Kevin Hemel and Frank Gubbles. I've got a show planning about Aachen, the Germans to Germantown and the Americans attacking Aachen. I've got the panel discussions, the tank cases. I've got signals coming up. There's lots of things happening. As soon as I get the dates, I will put them on YouTube and let you know. Please click subscribe if you'd like to visit our Patreon page, and please do that. And it just remains me to say once again, thanks you for watching. Thanks Duncan and Mag and Joe for doing the camera work, and thank you to our incredible team. It was really good. So this is Paul Woodadge on behalf of WW2TV saying thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you again next time. Right, I've ended the stream. It might carry on broadcasting for a couple of seconds.